No one noticed when I disappeared. That's the strangest part of this confession. There was no moment of concern, no questions, no alarm. People kept talking to me the same way, asking the same things, expecting the same responses. And I delivered them. I didn't leave my job. I didn't walk away from my relationships. I didn't change my address or my routines. I stayed. But something essential stepped out quietly, without ceremony, and never came back. If you had asked me back then how I was doing, I would have answered honestly, or at least what passed for honesty at the time. I'm fine. I believed that. Not because I was happy, but because nothing was wrong. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken enough to justify concern. My life worked. It functioned smoothly. Days followed each other without friction. That's how disappearance begins, not with loss, but with numbness. I remember the exact period when things started to dull. There wasn't a single event, no clear cause. Just a gradual fading, like sound lowering slowly until you don't realize it's gone. I stopped reacting strongly to things. Good news felt manageable. Bad news felt distant. Everything arrived wrapped in the same muted tone. At first, I appreciated it. Emotional neutrality felt like control. Like maturity. I told myself I had simply learned not to overreact, not to attach too much meaning to temporary situations. I was calm. Balanced. Stable. People admired that. What I didn't notice was how much effort it took to maintain that calm. How often I had to suppress impulses, opinions, reactions that felt inconvenient or unnecessary. How frequently I chose silence because speaking felt pointless. Little by little, I trained myself not to care too deeply. Not intentionally. Not consciously. It just felt easier that way. The world rewards people who don't complicate things. Who adapt. Who absorb discomfort without making it visible. I became very good at that. Too good. I stopped arguing. Stopped wanting strongly. Stopped imagining different futures. I told myself that contentment was quiet by nature, that passion was overrated, that intensity belonged to people who hadn't learned restraint yet. That story made sense. And it cost me more than I realized. There were moments, brief, intrusive, when I felt something stir underneath the surface. A sudden sadness with no clear reason. A flash of irritation that didn't match the situation. A sense of longing I couldn't name. I dismissed them quickly. I told myself they were just moods. Hormones. Fatigue. Anything but signals. The truth is, I was disappearing from my own life in a way that didn't interrupt anything. And because nothing collapsed, I assumed nothing was wrong. But absence doesn't announce itself. It waits. It waits until you're alone long enough to notice the echo. One evening, sitting in a familiar room, surrounded by things I had chosen carefully over the years, I felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. I didn't miss anyone, I didn't want anything. I didn't feel attached to the life I was living. And worst of all, I didn't feel alarmed by that. That was the moment I understood something had gone very wrong. Not because I was unhappy. But because I no longer knew what happiness would even feel like. I had stayed. I had survived. I had adapted. And somewhere along the way, I had quietly stopped existing. Once I noticed the emptiness, I couldn't unsee it. It didn't rush at me. It didn't demand attention. It simply sat there, heavy and patient, like something that had been waiting for permission to exist. And now that I had acknowledged it, it began to spread. I started paying attention to my own reactions, or rather, the lack of them. Things that should have moved me barely registered. Conversations drifted past without leaving marks. Even moments of intimacy felt distant, like I was watching myself participate from behind glass. I was present. But not involved. That realization terrified me more than sadness ever could. Sadness still implies connection. Numbness feels like exile. I tried to remember when I had last felt genuinely alive, not excited, not entertained, but alive. The memory didn't come easily. I had to dig past years of routines and obligations, past carefully managed days, back to a version of myself that felt unfamiliar now. That version scared me. Because he wanted things. He felt strongly. He questioned. He disrupted. And I had taught myself to see those traits as liabilities. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that wanting less meant suffering less. That detachment was a form of wisdom. That caring deeply was childish, risky, inefficient. So I trained myself out of it. The cost of that training became clearer with time. I began to feel disconnected not just from joy, but from meaning. Days passed without texture. Weeks blurred together. Life stopped accumulating memories and started repeating itself. I realized I wasn't depressed in the traditional sense. I still functioned. Still smiled. Still showed up. What I was experiencing was quieter, an emotional shutdown disguised as stability. The mental breakdown didn't look like collapse. It looked like competence without soul. I noticed how often I defaulted to logic when emotions were required. How quickly I minimized my own needs. How I framed every internal conflict as something to be managed rather than understood. I wasn't listening to myself anymore. I was supervising myself. That distance created a strange guilt, not for doing something wrong, but for doing nothing at all. For letting life happen without participating in it. There was a moment that crystallized everything. Someone asked me what I wanted next. Not what I planned. Not what I was responsible for. What I wanted. The word landed like a foreign language. I opened my mouth, ready to answer with something reasonable, and realized I had no idea. No internal pull. No desire rising to meet the question. Just silence. That silence exposed the truth I had been avoiding. I hadn't lost myself suddenly. I had slowly negotiated myself out of existence. Every time I chose peace over honesty. Every time I chose adaptation over expression. Every time I told myself, this isn't important enough to feel strongly about. Those moments accumulated. And now, I was left with a life that looked intact but felt hollow. The most painful part wasn't the emptiness itself. It was the fear that I might never feel deeply again, that I had numbed myself too effectively, that the door I closed for protection might be locked permanently. I began to wonder whether starting over was even possible when you no longer trusted your own desires. Because how do you rebuild a life when you don't know what you want it to contain? That question followed me everywhere. And eventually, it led me to the most uncomfortable realization of all: staying had kept me safe. But it had also slowly erased me. The turning point didn't feel like hope. It felt like grief. Grief for the version of myself I had abandoned so quietly that no one, including me, had noticed when he left. Grief for the years I had spent optimizing for stability while my inner life starved. I stopped trying to fix the numbness. That was the first real change. Instead of forcing positivity or searching for passion, I allowed myself to feel the loss. I sat with it. Let it exist without immediately turning it into a problem to solve. That alone was terrifying, because numbness had been my shield. Without it, everything felt exposed. I began with small acts of honesty. Not dramatic declarations, quiet admissions. Saying when I didn't care. Saying when I was tired. Saying when something mattered more than I had let on. Each time, my voice felt unfamiliar. Fragile. Real. Some people reacted with surprise. Others with discomfort. A few didn't notice at all. But something shifted inside me, a sense that I was finally participating in my own life again, even if awkwardly. I learned that feeling doesn't return all at once. It arrives in fragments. A sudden sadness over something insignificant. A flash of joy that disappears as quickly as it comes. A moment of anger that leaves me shaken. I welcomed all of it. Because feeling anything was better than the flatness I had mistaken for peace. The desire to escape resurfaced occasionally. The urge to retreat back into neutrality, into the safe fog of emotional distance. I understood then that numbness wasn't the absence of pain, it was the absence of risk. And living without risk is a slow form of disappearance. I started making choices without certainty. Letting myself want small, imperfect things. Accepting that desire doesn't need to be justified to be valid. That I didn't need to earn the right to care. The life I have now is not louder or more impressive than the one I lived before. It's more fragile. Less efficient. More demanding. But it's present. I still struggle with the fear that I stayed too long. That some parts of me are gone for good. That the version of myself I erased will never fully return. That may be true. But I also know this, disappearing doesn't require leaving. It only requires silence. And returning doesn't require reinvention. It requires attention. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself staying, adapting, surviving, ask yourself one question: are you still here, or are you just functioning? I stayed. And for a long time, I was already gone. Choosing to feel again didn't give me back the past. But it gave me back a future that includes me. And after everything, that feels like enough.